The basic premise of electric vehicles is this. With component makers supplying most or all of the components, as they do these days, anyone can build electric vehicles. And there are now many dozens of electric vehicle makers out there that make nothing but EVs. The hard part is the battery. They're expensive, but automakers, including Tesla, don't own or control the expensive core technology the battery sells. And this whole dynamic is creating a nightmare of loss of control by legacy automakers from BMW to Ford as their highly complex internal combustion engines, transmission technologies, and emission control technologies are being replaced by an electric motor and an expensive battery. But the most expensive part of the battery cells, they don't control. And even as these legacy automakers deny it, this sheer dread of new competition and the desperate efforts to try to stay in control of their core technologies are shaking up the entire industry. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Wolf Richter of WOLFSTREET.com, and you're listening to the Wolf Street Report. It's Sunday, February 10th, 2019. That anyone can make EVs is shown by this example. Back in 2014, the German post office, which also owns DHL, the whole thing being called Deutsche Post DHL Group, acquired a German startup called Street Scooter, which was trying to make some battery electric vans for urban delivery. By 2016, Deutsche Post DHL said it would produce 10,000 bare-bones postal delivery vehicles annually and replace 70% of its existing fleet of internal combustion engine vehicles with these street scooters. The smallest version of this post office vehicle has a range of up to 50 miles and a payload capacity of about 1,500 pounds, which is sufficient for mail delivery in the densely populated German cities. While the delivery vehicles are primarily for Deutsche Post's own use, they are now being sold to other companies. Production capacity is being increased to about 20,000 delivery vehicles a year. The startup relies on suppliers to design and make all the parts and assemblies, including the German company Bosch, one of the world's largest auto component makers, which supplies the electric powertrain and other electrical components. Ford Motor Company supplies the chassis of the street scooter's larger version, which has a range of about 120 miles and can carry over 200 parcels. This chassis is based on Ford's Transit van. Other component makers supply the other components and assemblies, including the batteries and the technologies around the batteries. And battery cell makers supply the cells to the battery makers, then combine many of these cells into a battery pack. By November 2017, Deutsche Post DHL hit its annual target for that year to put 5,000 street scooters into service. Here's the thing. German automakers poo-pooed the idea of electric delivery vehicles. Volkswagen Group, the largest or second largest automaker in the world, depending on how you look at it, was deeply into diesels at the time and didn't want to be sidetracked by EVs. This was before Dieselgate broke the back of diesels in Europe. Volkswagen Group would have been the ideal automaker to get into these electric vehicles, but it refused to even bid on the contract. So Deutsche Post had to strike out on its own, and if a postal service can pull it off, anyone can. Much of the electric vehicle work is happening in China, where the government has made it a national priority to dominate the technology. Over the past 6 years, China has plowed over $10 billion into subsidies into the battery industry for electric vehicles to kickstart the industry by hook or crook. By 2017, there were about 135 auto battery makers in China, but then the government curtailed the subsidies as it was trying to get a handle on the abuse and fraud in the system, and many of the battery makers instantly collapsed. By the end of 2018, the number of battery makers was down to 90. The largest battery cell manufacturers for EVs in the world in terms of shipments is Panasonic, which makes the battery cells for Tesla and other EV makers. The second largest battery maker for EVs is a Chinese company called CATL. In third place is another Chinese company, BYD, in which Warren Buffett has a stake. BYD is somewhat unique in that it started out as a battery maker for mobile phones and then expanded into making electric vehicles. It's the only automaker that makes its own battery cells and thus controls its own core technology, though its technology may not be the most advanced in the world. In fourth and fifth place are the Korean battery makers LG Chem and Samsung. The remaining 5 of the top 10 battery cell manufacturers for EVs are all Chinese. The Chinese battery cell makers have sprung up due to government support, and now they're being culled as the government support is being withdrawn. And there are dozens of automakers in China that make only electric vehicles, and they're facing a big shakeout too. But in 2018, sales of battery electric vehicles in China surged 60% to over 1 million vehicles, reaching a record 5% of total vehicle sales, even as sales of vehicles with internal combustion engines fell for the first time since data has been published in 1990. China has been piling incentives on electric vehicles, trying to push this segment to reach 20% of total sales by 2025, and the way things are going, it's likely to get there. In addition, all automakers active in China are now required to produce and sell EVs in China. Many automakers, including Nissan, Tesla, and BMW, are making their own battery packs and design the technology that controls them. But they all get the battery cells, the most expensive part, from battery cell suppliers such as Panasonic, CATL, or LG Chem. Only China's BYD makes its own battery cells, but its cell technology lags behind. Battery electric vehicles are not going to be for everyone, but they're arriving on the scene as a real choice for many people and companies, and it's a vehicle category that is being subsidized by governments, and it's growing in leaps and bounds globally, though from a still very small base. All global automakers are beginning to offer battery electric vehicles in the lineups. The thing is, component makers can make the assemblies, the whole gamut of it. Suspension assemblies, wiring harnesses, power leather seats fully assembled, computer modules, and entire electric drivetrains. Apple, Google, and others are trying to take over the consumer electronics inside vehicles that produce anything from music and navigation systems to the services a smartphone provides. And they're trying to get their systems into any vehicles, not just EVs, but an EV maker that doesn't want to develop its own sophisticated electronic software and services now has an instant supplier for them. Legacy automakers are resisting allowing Apple and Google to take over the user experience of the vehicle. With EVs, it may be one of the few items left for them that are technologically proprietary. EVs are a lot simpler to manufacture and a lot cheaper than internal combustion engine vehicles, except for the battery, which makes EVs expensive. But the core technology of batteries, the most expensive and critical part, the actual cells, are not controlled by automakers. The battery cells are so expensive that they still put EVs at a cost disadvantage over internal combustion engine vehicles, just from a manufacturing cost perspective. But the costs of battery cells have been falling, and performance has been improving, and component makers are now catering to EV makers with specialized assemblies, and the whole auto industry is facing a commoditization of vehicles. This is a real threat to legacy automakers. For example, BMW, which long ridiculed EVs, started out as an aircraft engine maker. The internal combustion engines in its vehicles are a big reason why people pay extra to buy a BMW. It was a competitive advantage that the company has been touting for decades. But with the arrival of EVs in the BMW lineup, this competitive advantage that BMW put billions of Deutschmarks and euros and dollars into just vanishes. It will be competing on how good the battery is, and the battery cells are someone else's technology that other automakers can acquire too. Volkswagen, late to the EV game, already announced that it will have to restructure its manufacturing operations over the next few years and lay off thousands of employees in its engine and transmission plants. Other automakers are having to look at similar issues because electric motors are just a breeze to build compared to an entire internal combustion engine powertrain. This is a gradual process, and it won't happen overnight. It will play out over the years. And in this process, the legacy automakers are losing their competitive advantage, and they're having to rely on technology and an expensive core component that they don't control. This will shake up manufacturing operations and supply chains. It will also produce a shakeout, with new arrivals that are now being eagerly accommodated by component makers pressuring the legacy automakers. This has already happened on a fairly large scale in China. In the US, Tesla sales have taken a bite out of BMW and Mercedes, and both companies are now forced to defend their turf with their own EVs. Porsche, a unit of Volkswagen Group, is expected to start selling its EV in the US later this year. At the high end, EVs can likely be produced at a profit today, but at the low end, this still eludes automakers because of the cost of the battery, such a big part of the vehicle's total costs. But those costs are coming down, especially once true mass production by the most efficient automakers takes over, something that is just now in the works. The issue for the industry is that over the next few years, at the mass market price points, EVs will lead to a commoditization for manufacturers, with many vehicles sharing the same core components, a lot more than they already are doing today, and the only difference may be the skin and paint job. And when this happens, the legacy automakers are in for a majestic battle with squeezed margins and a possibly serious shakeout. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Wolf Richter of WOLFSTREET.com. Thank you for listening to the Wall Street Report.